Good evening. Welcome to this evening's live stream. I'll introduce our guests for this week in just a little while, but I'll mention a few things just while people are tuning in, so to speak. I would encourage you all to sign up for our annual conference, which is coming up on the 14th of November. That's going to be online, obviously, but we've got speakers from different countries and on lots of different topics. So it's going to be a really interesting day. It's free for members of the Scottish Family Party. It's only £5 if you're not a member. But we'll try and get a link in the comments in just a minute. But do sign up for that. I say it's going to be a really good day. Our live stream next week, we've got another special guest. Next week, we've got Dr. Stuart Wayton. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Dr. Wayton. He's been involved in campaigning against the named person scheme, against the smacking ban, and currently against the hate crime, hate speech legislation. So Stuart's a very interesting chap. So I'm sure that will be a stimulating discussion next week. Something else to mention now is the Scottish Family Party. We're just getting to the sort of serious stage of selecting our candidates for the election next year. So if that's something you're interested in, stand as a candidate, maybe in your own constituency and on the list as well, do drop us an email, contact@scottishfamily.org, and we can put you into the system there and see how that turns out. Now, a week or so ago, I made a video about modern studies, this subject unique to Scotland, and I was saying it just amounts to certificated indoctrination. So I made the video, and quite a lot of people viewed it, a lot of people coming on saying, oh, they completely disagreed, what a load of nonsense. But I kept saying to people, please, will someone come and debate it? Come on the live stream and come and put your view and let's test it in the battle of ideas. But it's been quite difficult to get some. But I think we might have someone who's come forward willing to debate. A modern studies teacher in Scotland has said that they're going to do it. But there's one slight catch. They've said they're going to check with their head of faculty and head teacher first. My guess would be that they're going to say, no way, we can't have open discussion of educational issues in Scotland. But I might be wrong. I might be wrong. So we shall see. So if you hear in the next couple of weeks we've got someone coming on, then this head teacher and head of faculty have made the right call. But I'm not at all optimistic, but let's hope that they come on. I just remind, obviously, if you put comments into Facebook or YouTube, they come up on screen here. If you've got questions, we can bring those on screen and discuss them. And comments as well, we might bring them on screen and highlight them from time to time. So do tap away on your keyboards. You'll be able to take part in the discussion through that means. Right, now time to introduce our special guest for this week, and that's Pastor Andrew Owen of Destiny Church. So welcome to Andrew. Good to have you with us.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much for having me. Great to be with you.
My pleasure. So Destiny Church, some people will probably be quite familiar with Destiny Church. To other people, might be the first time they've ever heard of it. So tell us a little bit about Destiny Church and your role in it.
Okay, so I'm the founding pastor of Destiny Church and Destiny Ministries based out of Glasgow. We started here with the church 30 years ago with 6 people. The church just kept on growing. It's grown across Scotland, across Europe, and we've got about 1,500 churches around the world now. It's a young, contemporary, evangelical church.
Right, that's great. Now, obviously, as the Scottish Family Party podcast, we're not going to be focusing on the church in particular, but Andrew's got some experiences to talk about that are very, very relevant to us, because Andrew's been at the centre of some key issues in Scotland, freedom of speech issues. And that's where we're going to focus on for the first part of this evening, at the very least. Now, I'm sure you'll have been aware of the Franklin Graham controversy. Andrew, I won't steal your thunder. Tell us the story. You were at the heart of it.
So, Franklin Graham, the Billy Graham Association, very famous, of course, they were coming to the SECC Hydro for an event this year. And remarkably, 450 or thereabouts churches agreed to participate and to be involved with it. You know, I've been a pastor in Glasgow a long time, and I've never seen that amount of people or that number of churches engage with a project like that. So 14,000 seat venue, It really looked like we were going to fill that venue, and everybody was very excited about it. It was the only venue in Scotland for that Franklin Graham tour, but there were 7 other venues through the UK. And so there were 8 events in total. Ours was the only one in Scotland, and we were all excited. But then, one after the other, various venues began to shut Franklin Graham down, lock him out, accusing him of hate speech and hate crimes and all kinds of things, didn't like his connection to Trump, and on it went. And so Glasgow SECC joined in on the bandwagon and cancelled that event. First of all, it was a breach of a contract, but of course, many people, not just them and their organization, but what about 450 churches and the tens of thousands of people we represent, had our rights squashed and annihilated in effect. And I know that Franklin Graham's organization are taking each of those venues to court bit by bit, and the SECC Hydro is a current court case.
Right, very good. What do you think tipped it for them in their decision? Was there anything in particular, or any?
Well, the interesting thing about the SEC Hydro is it's technically run as a limited company, but 95% shareholding is Glasgow City Council. And I know firsthand that the board at the Hydro, because I've spoken to the chairman, did not want to cancel Franklin Graham. They wanted the event to continue. Not that they agreed or disagreed with what he had to say. They just thought, in principle, we can't cancel people. But they were overruled by Susan Aiken, who sits on that board and obviously leads Glasgow City Council, SNP party, and they brought a clear LGBTQ agenda to the table. Yeah. No doubt about it.
Yeah. I've just got the BBC report in front of me here. When the BBC starts saying, Franklin Graham, eldest son of late preacher Billy Graham, said he believes homosexuality is a sin. Now, the BBC believe that's a leading point to make in a news article, even though that's the standard teaching of sort of Orthodox Christian churches around the world and always has been. But the BBC seem to think that's newsworthy. But Susan Aiken, you just mentioned, I mean, this is what she said. It would not be appropriate. The reporting of the ways in which Mr. Graham expresses his views makes clear that this is not simply about offence or disagreement, neither is it a debate about free speech. I mean, where do you even start with that? So she's shutting down someone because she disagrees with them, then says it's not about disagreement or free speech. I mean, where do you even start responding to this? Then she said, how he expresses his views could, I believe, fundamentally breach the council's statutory equalities duties. In other words, she's saying she thought it would have been illegal to allow this prominent Christian preacher to speak in Glasgow. Illegal. I think it's just bizarre, isn't it?
Totally bizarre. And we had a similar response in that I gathered a small delegation of pastors represented those 450 churches to go and meet with her. That was on the agenda. She kept arguing and saying, this has nothing to do with Christianity. It's nothing to do with churches. You're welcome to say whatever you want. In the event, that meeting got cancelled because of COVID. She didn't want to continue it on Zoom. But that was her. There's this dichotomy constantly that when you try to grasp the nettle and have a discussion, you can't seem to get a handle on the conversation. And we found that the same in Edinburgh also. Yeah. I think the sad thing is that very often, especially when it comes to Franklin, who is very active on Twitter, of course, that lots of people perceive the fact that traditional Christians, traditional Bible-believing Christians will have a particular view about homosexuality. They translate that to mean you must hate homosexuals or you must hate the LGBTQ community. Mm-hmm. But I've got lots of friends in that community, and I constantly have discussions with those people. And it's nothing to do with hate. It's a difference of opinion.
Do you think that's a genuine mistake on their part, or do you think it's a tactic? Do they actually know full well that you're a perfectly reasonable, frankly, Graham, is a perfectly reasonable, kind, decent human being, but they try to present him as something else, or do they really believe that he's full of hatred?
Well, I think it's the same with lots of these things at the moment. There's a radical wing in the middle of all of it that drives the agenda, and I think amongst that community, there's a percentage that are driving that agenda through fake news and all the rest that goes with it, and there's a percentage who are just innocent bystanders in that community.
Yeah. If you think about it, the average person probably doesn't pay much attention to the news or politics, just reads a BBC headline here and there. Then all you see is, anti-gay hate preacher banned from Glasgow.
Yeah.
And probably for a majority of the people, that's as far as it goes. That's their impression formed. But I think the tactic from Susan Aitken here, she's trying to avoid Christians coming back and saying, well, look, that's what we believe. That's Orthodox Christian teaching. So you're well out of order here. So she's trying to claim it's not because of what he believes, it's the way he says it. And as soon as you say, it's the way he expresses it, then it all gets a bit vague and muddy and hard to pin down. So I think that's the tactic.
They gave assurances that the event in Glasgow was nothing whatsoever to do with that conversation or that subject. It would never be raised. They were the only ones raising it from past comments of years ago. But that wasn't enough. Yeah. The mob rule had its way.
Yeah. Well, I'm finding this, it's very frustrating at the moment in the family party. We've been doing a bit of research into the views expressed by some people who are, employed by the government, quite influential in the government. I'm finding some pretty shocking things. But, we can expose these things. It doesn't make any difference to these people. Yeah. But someone who just strays a little bit from what they think the new orthodoxy is, then
I think that's partly, just trying to get a decent voice heard in any media at the minute is difficult, because the media, certainly in the UK, is so left-wing that you can't find a balanced opinion on a proper discussion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, and that's our experience. We've come to the conclusion we've basically given up on the mainstream media. Yeah. We used to think, maybe if we do this, maybe that will get some coverage. But we've got to the stage now we think that no matter what we do, there's not going to be any coverage. They've got their particular issues, and other issues they just think are too hot to address.
But I think they have an agenda. We were stitched up by the Times, the National Times, 2 years ago by a reporter who turned up at one of our conferences and wrote complete untruths. Yeah. I mean, this is the Times national newspaper. What he wrote, I mean, there were over 1,000 people to witness to the fact that what he said was just blatant untruths. And they published it, printed it, and ran that story for several weeks.
Yeah.
And would not print an alternative comment other than, we've said it's fake news.
Yeah. I mean, our experience with the Times was that when I had got to ask a question of John Swinney, I don't know if you saw it, about sex education, and order broke down in the meeting and there was chaos and whatever. So I sent that video and a report to various newspapers, including the Times. So I sent it to them saying, look, this is me, we're the Scottish Family Party, this is what happened. And they reported it. They ran an article on it, but they didn't mention me or the Scottish Family Party. I became a parent in the audience. So obviously they made the decision that, no, we don't want to give them any airtime. It's a good story, but we'd rather not mention anything about you. It's interesting, the BBC article here as well, you've got a Church of Scotland minister weighing in, saying, yes, it should be banned as well. But
which is very unfortunate.
I looked at some other things online. I mean, the Sun headline, gay hate pastor. That was a headline. So like completely way over to one side.
And the sad thing is, Franklin Graham runs the Samaritan's Purse, which is a huge NGO, a Christian NGO.
Yeah.
Who have spent millions of pounds in the UK and recently through the COVID challenge here in Glasgow. providing food and help and aid, and they'll help anybody, any race, creed, sexual preference, anybody gets help, and they take the help. But none of that is ever printed or broadcast or spoken of.
Yeah, I think more and more people now have got the sort of moral priorities that if you've got the right views on the politically correct issues, you're a good person. What else you do, whether or not you're a cheat and a liar and you couldn't care less about people with problems around you, whatever, all that doesn't matter. Counts for nothing. If you've just got the right views, then you can hold your head up high.
And this virtue signaling by all the big businesses, I think, becomes a real challenge because the virtues are changing every single month. And what they stood for this month, they'll oppose next month as different views gain traction around the world. But virtue signaling has become big business, isn't it?
Yeah. If the Scottish Family Party became the government at the next election, then suddenly you'd see lots of the grass would suddenly bend in the other direction. There's a few hardcore campaigners, I think, but even in the Scottish Parliament, the majority of the MSPs, they just go with the flow. Whatever's going to be easy and get you a pat on the back, they'll just go with that, and that's the way it heads. Right, so that was Franklin Graham. So court cases awaited on that. Just to say about that, with Glasgow City Council, we had a demonstration outside the council chambers one extremely wet Saturday morning.
I was there.
Yes, Yeah, I saw your face in there.
Soaked to the skin.
We had about 100 people, which again, half that number is enough to get you on in the paper if you're on in the right cause. But because it didn't fit their agenda, there's no media coverage at all. But thing with those is it flies on social media. People see that people are standing up against it, and there is a strength of feeling. So I think that was definitely worth doing. We'd actually got one planned for Edinburgh just before the lockdown came, which brings us on to Edinburgh. So tell us about your adventures with Edinburgh City Council.
Well, we have a live court case at the moment. We've taken SECC, City of Edinburgh Council, to court. We're pursuing for a judicial review. We hold an annual conference called Surge. 1 year we do it in Glasgow, 1 year we do it in Edinburgh. This year we were to be in Edinburgh at the Usher Hall, and the Usher Hall management saw it fit to cancel our booking. They cancelled our booking on the strength of one of our keynote speakers, an American, had written in one of his books. He's a prolific author, but he'd written in one of his books his view of marriage, which is a traditional Christian view of marriage. They perceived that as hate speech. They perceived that as antagonistic, and on the strength of his view of a 10-year-old book, they cancelled our entire event. They didn't tell us. We read it in the paper.
Wow.
And they then called us like an hour later that morning to tell us that they'd breached and cancelled our contract, and they were perfectly entitled to do so. We couldn't work out rhyme or reason. We gave them assurances that the conference was nothing to do with that book or that conversation. That subject wasn't even coming up. But they were adamant that they were going to cancel this. We asked to meet with the management. They wouldn't meet with us. We asked to have various meetings with people at the Edinburgh City Council. They didn't want to do that. And so they cancelled the event. Obviously, at that point, it was at considerable cost to us because we'd already done the advertising, we'd taken the bookings, we had flights bought and arranged, and 1,000 other things that costs had been incurred. We then pursued it. It ran in the paper a little bit. We asked them further for a meeting, and to backtrack on that, they then agreed that they would reinstate the booking if we cancelled that speaker. So if we cancelled that speaker, we could have the building back. Then we felt that was a point of principle. We pointed out to them that over the last year, we pulled up the bookings for the last year at the Usher Hall, which included drag queens, all kinds of comedians who had said all kinds of things. They had everything conceivable in there in the year before and in the year after.
Yeah.
But one guy's book, one comment in a book written 10 years ago, got us cancelled. So, having taken legal advice, we realized that they had broken UK law, EU law, and human rights, Article the UN, Article of Human Rights. So we've taken them to court. And that
Excellent.
case is now live. They've tried every trick in the book so far to find a way through that, but we can't, our legal team can't see what possible defense that they're going to come up with.
Yeah.
Because in law, they don't have one.
Yeah. But this case brought it quite close to home to me, because I think, I don't know, 2 years or whatever, I went to the conference. My church, which is along the road, instead of its normal Sunday morning service, we went along to the conference, the Destiny conference in the Usher Hall. So you go along 1 year, and then a couple of years later, you find the council's banned it.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's hopefully brought home the situation we're in to a lot of people. There are a lot of people at the conference, so hopefully that will be quite powerful for them.
And as far as we're aware, it's the first and only time that it's an entirely city, a council, public-owned building has kicked out a Christian organization or a church in that way, for that reason. So the case is not only important for us, the case is important for every single church in the UK. It's a test case. And although the law is on our side, apparently the law has never been tested in this particular way. So the case is pressing forward as we speak. Yeah.
I've got the report here from Pink News, that very balanced and neutral publication. So you can guarantee with Pink News, they've got the worst quotes they could possibly get from Larry Stockskill. I mean, they haven't left the worst ones in the drawer and just used some other ones. This is the very best they've got. I mean, they've got things like, he wrote on his blog that gay marriage was a dangerous moral issue. I mean, don't be deceived. Homosexuality is not normal behavior and is not accepted by God. Now, lots of people would disagree, but that hardly sounds like hateful ranting to me. If the average person today has no concern for the gross immorality and debauchery existing in our society, Pink News quote that statement against him. So it's outrageous that anyone should be concerned about gross immorality and debauchery. You know, you should be banned if you're concerned about gross immorality.
It's the new virtue, isn't it?
Yeah. And then there's this bit. He says, so Larry was saying, he's talking about other people. He's saying such individuals think homosexuality is gay, abortion is necessary, drunkenness and adultery are acceptable. For God's saints, however, these things should be repulsive and deeply grievous. Now, that's quite hard-hitting. I can see what he's saying, but that gets translated by the media into he is saying gay people are repulsive. But he's not saying that. It's not saying that. It's deliberate misrepresentation. But that's the mainstream. That's not just some unaccountable blogger. That's what ends up in the mainstream media with this, isn't it? Yeah,
that is true. And they just keep repeating that. It's cut and paste then, those kinds of things over and over and over again.
Yeah. So if you imagine that whatever happens with the court case, the thing with the legal system is even if you win the court case, that's with the current judges, lawyers, etc. Given another 10 years, you might find a different set of judges who will probably, their views will have moved on, shall we say. So I think ultimately the legal system isn't going to protect in the long term. But ultimately, the political system controls the legal system. So if there's not change politically, then I think that the law might slow things down and put a brake on here and there. But ultimately, it's got to come from the top. But how do you see things developing? What will start happening next? Do you think will be individual churches are targeted, or?
I think there's several things going on, and we've had a lot of support over this court case, but not every Christian is happy that we're going to court.
Mm-hmm.
We've had some Christians say Jesus said, turn the other cheek, forget about it, roll over. But I think the church has been silent for far too long and given too much ground already.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have to find our voice. So from a Christian, from a church perspective, I think we need to become more militant than we've ever been. We need to speak up, engage, be involved, and let our voice be heard. Otherwise, the present leftist liberal trend that we see in society is just on a permanent downward spiral.
Yeah.
My kids are growing up now, but I got grandkids, and I'm deeply concerned about their education. I'm deeply concerned about the world that they are having to live in and negotiate and navigate. And I think we have a part and a place to speak up and to say, and we need to engage. And I think it's regrettable that very few Christians engage strongly politically. And with this present hate crime bill that's going through, I've met several of the MSPs, including Christian MSPs, and find that many of the MSPs are completely oblivious to the Christian viewpoint. They're just unaware of the Christian viewpoint. I spoke to one Christian MSP who seems unaware of the Christian viewpoint.
Yeah.
And unless we engage and speak and talk, the world is running riot and running ahead of us.
Yeah, absolutely. I found, my current issue, I've talked about it lots of times. The General Teaching Council for Scotland is on my case because I said children need a mum and a dad ideally, and there's going to be a hearing quite soon. And the police recorded it as a hate incident. And I've known Christian MSPs who know my story, and they know that the police regard me saying that children need a mum and a dad ideally as hate speech. But they don't connect that with, if you give the government even more power to deal with hate speech, so instead of just recording it in a database, it will actually become illegal. And they still can't see the danger. They've still got this confidence that somehow the police are going to be able to deal with this in some sort of even-handed way. But I don't know if it's burying their head in the sands or too optimistic a view of human nature. I'm not sure. But I just think reality indicates that people should be really concerned in the direction things are going. But I think another factor with Christians, I think sometimes some Christians in particular, when they hear about a story of a Christian getting into hot water, what they tend to think is, that the reason that happened is they weren't quite as wise as me. If that had been me, I'd have done that slightly differently, and I would have avoided that. So it's a shame that person was, not quite up to my standard, but, and that's it really. That's the end of the story. But as that goes, it's just more and more people will come into the firing line. And if we don't unite and respond and stick up for each other, then I think it's just going to be a one-way street.
I agree. And the interesting thing is, although this hate crime bill is not yet through, it's already been quoted by the defence of Edinburgh City Council as part of their argument, as if it's law already.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see the trend in the way things are going. Yeah.
Something I find interesting, talking about my situation with the GTCS again. Quite often with Christians, I'll tell them the story, and the reaction is sort of, "Oh," and I'll think, "Have you got more to say?" So they don't know what to say. Whereas what I would like people to say is, "Yes, I agree with what you say, and it's absolutely outrageous that you've been treated like this." That's the reaction I would like. But a more common reaction is just, "Oh, it does not compute. I don't really know how to respond to that issue." So I think there's like a sort of education issue that people need to become aware that these are really serious concerns in society, so that they can then just understand what's going on.
And people do take things at very shallow face value, don't they? And don't often think much further than the headline. Of the implications of what they're about.
Think about in the future. I don't know if you heard about this case. There's a church, I can't remember where it is in Scotland. Quite a small church, I think. They applied for planning permission to build a new building. and some local, you can imagine who the people are, the people who really objected to the church's values. And they made it absolutely clear that they don't want that church because they disagree with its beliefs. But they've objected to the planning on the grounds that the car park's not big enough, that, all sorts of practical things. But they're perfectly open that the real reason is they don't want those values in their community. Now, would you be confident that a local council would just ignore that sort of thing? Would they see through it? I wouldn't be confident at all. I can imagine that there'll be churches before too long who just won't be able to get planning permission to build buildings.
Yeah.
Or extend buildings.
That's a real possibility. We have friends and we work in other countries, places like Malaysia, and I've got pastor friends in Malaysia who've been waiting 25 years to get planning permission from an Islamic government to build a building. They own the land already.
Yeah.
And they just stall one thing after another.
Yeah.
The political agendas control a lot of our local authorities, and it's no longer about the needs of the community or the interests of the people. It's the ideology behind it that they're driving forward.
Yeah.
And of course, those people by nature are activists, so they've got themselves into that position to start with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, we as Christians, we need, our vote counts. Our voice needs to be heard. We need to think deeply about our values and push back.
Yeah, absolutely. Preaching to the converted here. We touched on the hate speech legislation there. There's obviously widespread concerns on that. What's your take been on that and to the debate that there's been around it?
Well, I think it's the most ridiculous law that they've tried to pass to date. And I can't see its purpose. I can't see its point when there's already existing laws that provide sufficient protection. Then all kinds of people are speaking out against it, from comedians to the Scottish Police Federation, to the judicial system, to churches. I can't find one person who thinks it's a great idea other than the MSPs.
Yeah.
And we've raised our objection. I've had deep conversation. One Christian MSP said to me, but this will protect you in the future. So this law will be used to put me in prison in the future. That's what that law will be used for. Mm-hmm. It's designed to stop us speaking out our views and our opinions. It's not going to do one thing. And I feel for the police. How's the police ever going to enforce such a law like that? It's going to come down to intent and opinion at the end of the day.
Yeah. But the police's record in terms of street preachers is already, appalling. Yeah. But they basically arrest street preachers left, right, and centre. And then they go to court, and every time that the case is dismissed. And yet they'll then arrest the same person the next Saturday and put them in a cell and put them through the same thing again, knowing full well that there's actually no case to answer. So that's the current situation, but give them more legal powers like that. It's very concerning. But I think with the hate speech legislation, there would be some outrageous cases, but the main effect would just be the chilling effect. Most people would just think, I do not want to go through, a year's court case. That would it would destroy my reputation. It's on your sort of CV, if you like, forevermore. What's it going to do to your job? Stress levels. So a huge number of people and organizations would think, oh, we better let's just be wise, as they might call it.
And the interesting thing is, even with our case against Edinburgh Council, we've had to privately fund that. So we've had to crowdfund and raise the funds. Mm-hmm. Theirs are paid with the taxpayers' money. Their defense is paid by my taxes. Yeah. And in the same way that they spend fortunes creating these bills, it's not their money. It's our money paying for it. And so you end up paying twice. Yeah. We pay to have created it, and then we could pay to fight it.
Yeah. But it's the same with virtually every organisation in Scotland funded by the government that would take the opposite view to the Scottish Family Party. And I just think if you were on that side of the argument, it would be a different world. You would just walk into a job where you get paid to argue for your political and sort of philosophical beliefs. Totally different world. Whereas I'm more at the stage where, career options become pretty limited when you've spoken out about a lot of things and you're worried about the police in the future. But if you're on the other side, you're worried about whether or not you're going to get the top job at the sock puppet charity and get an extra 10,000 a year, and you're on course for all sorts of honours and whatever. It's totally. If you look at consultation responses to Scottish government bills, I think for the hate crime one, wasn't it? There was like 90% of individuals were against it.
That's right.
90% of organisations funded by the government, almost all of them, are for it. And that's the way it goes. It just gets pushed along in the same direction.
Yeah,
it's a big system basically that needs to be challenged.
Yeah,
and there are so many people who it's in their interest to play along with it, and it's against their personal interest to challenge it. There are negative consequences to challenging any part of the system. So fewer and fewer people.
It takes a lot of courage to do that, and very few people can step up or pay for it. Either pay for it emotionally or financially, or dragged into the media because of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think with the hate speech thing, I was amazed. I mean, I'm not sure I've seen a single article in the media in support of it, apart from maybe one or two written by people from government-funded charities. But it seems like you were saying, everyone seems to be against it from all angles. So I think it might be modified quite a bit before it goes through. I think it is okay to oppose that. You're not destroying your career if you say you're against the hate speech legislation. Yeah. So I think there will be a bit of a pushback. When you get to like the things with Franklin Graham and the Usher Hall, I mean, that's an area where you've really got to be brave to put your head above the parapet on that one, because they really are out to get you. But the hate speech, I'm a bit more optimistic that there might be a bit more fight back about it.
You think it will go through at all?
I think it will go through. It'll go through in some form or another. There'll be a few more modifications to it. I think in the Scottish Parliament, there's lots of MSPs opposing it, but then there's a lot of opportunism. If you look at what's going on in the rest of Britain, like look at Franklin Graham, for example, cancelled in 7 venues or whatever in the rest of Britain. What's the UK government doing about that? There's freedom of speech horror stories coming from England just as much as from Scotland.
Yeah.
So I don't think there's really the will among any of the parties in the Scottish Parliament to defend freedom of speech. I think there's a will to try and score a point against the SNP while they're vulnerable. But I'm not sure underneath it all there's a real concern about freedom of speech. That's my...
The interesting thing about our court case, as it came to light, we had support from very unlikely sources.
Mm-hmm.
The head of the secular society, even the humanist, some of the humanist society were, we don't agree with one thing that you think or say, but we would die for your right to say it.
Yeah.
And
that's good.
I think, we live in a great country. We need to make it great again and have the freedom to say what we need to say. And I think most sensible people recognize hate when they see it. They recognize racism when they see it. I think most people are like that. But these bills that are coming through are aiming at ordinary folks, ordinary people who will be trapped by some unthought through technicality in some misdemeanor somewhere. Yeah.
Well, the Germany in the 20s and 30s, they had really good hate speech legislation. So quite a few Nazis were prosecuted for it. And the result of that was it just gave them notoriety, made them famous, made them martyrs, and helped their cause along the way.
Gosh.
And I think that's inevitably what's going to happen. If you allow people, I mean, no matter how outrageous it is something said, if you give them the opportunity to present themselves as a martyr, then it's an own goal.
Yeah. I remember once we had in Glasgow, where one of our buildings is, we had as our MP at Westminster the longest serving Muslim MP in the UK at the time, Mohammed Sawa. And He was obviously heavily involved in the community in which we were functioning and operating, and he and I got to know each other, and I invited him to come and speak at the church. And one of the questions I'd asked him was, what do you think is the role of the church, of the Christian, in this community? And his reply to that was that the church and the Christian community is meant to be the moral voice, and if you don't speak up, we will lose all morality. That was said about 7 years ago, and look at the ground that's been lost since that point.
Yeah, yeah. You wouldn't hear that from many of them.
No.
Nowadays. Okay, just another issue we just touched on before we went live. It'd be really interesting to hear your take on. We just talked about the Black Lives Matter movement, something been in the news a lot over the last few months. What's your experience in this issue?
Well, I think first of all, we were all horrified when we saw the death of George Floyd in such a barbaric way. I think the world was shocked by that. But then the weeks that followed became a real challenge, because firstly, for us as Destiny Churches, we have a very large international community. Many of our members, staff, leaders are Black from one country or another. And it's kind of a great, I love it. I think it's a great racial mix. I think we've never had racial issues. But as that thing began to move and Black Lives Matter came into the fore, every Christian believes that racism in all its form is wrong, as far as I'm aware. Nobody wants to tolerate any kind of racism. And I went around and spoke to many of our Black members to hear from them personally what their experience of racism actually was. And I was horrified to find that every one that I spoke to had their own personal story to tell of racism. And so there clearly is a problem. And there is a problem that does need dealing with. But we also had a challenge in that I had people contact me saying, you must speak up and fight for Black Lives Matter. And people call me and say, don't dare get involved with Black Lives Matter. All of them Christians. And I think very often, and we certainly found amongst many of our young people, that they were not aware of the ideology that was driving the movement called Black Lives Matter. And cultural Marxism, or critical theory, which drives that movement, is atheistic, it's anti-God, it's anti-Bible. It in itself is racist. And that theory is very, very destructive. It wants to annihilate, it's anarchy, it wants to destroy, it wants to disable any aspect of leadership or authority or governance of any form, shape, and way. And so the ideology driving the movement is a real dark ideology, but the cause of racism and fighting all of that is a good one. And so it's getting people to understand where that meets. So we've declined to ever associate with the term or the movement called Black Lives Matter, but we'll do everything that we can to fight racism wherever we would find it. I think as a church and as a movement, we're very integrated. We have many different races on staff, different levels of leadership, and very involved with us. But it became a real issue at that point.
Mm-hmm. But the whole central theme of critical theory, as I understand it, is that everything's a power struggle.
Uh-huh.
So whereas you might have had a harmonious community that you thought, it's teaching basically members of that community that this actually is a power struggle. There's got to be winners and losers.
Yeah.
If you're of a certain race, then you're on the losing side, and you've got to fight against the other side in order to get equality. And it's a battle, but they won't give up their power easily. So don't expect it to be anything other than a hard slog to get that. It's just so destructive of harmony. Just starting from the worst possible assumption.
Yeah. So you're in one of two camps, aren't you? You're either the oppressor or you're the oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they define that by your race. So if you're a white man, you're the ultimate oppressor.
Uh-huh.
And if you're a black woman, you're the oppressed. And then they have the intersectionality where, if you're a black feminist woman, if you're a black lesbian woman, then your intersectionality, it gives you brownie points to being more oppressed than others. But it's just setting one section of society against another. It's full of hatred and bitterness.
And then you find in the Scottish Parliament, you get MSPs who maybe, blokes in their 50s and 60s or whatever, will be coming out with this language. I'm sure they'd probably never heard of it 5 years ago, but now that they'll speak it as though it's their very own.
Yeah.
And to what extent do they really believe it? Do they really accept it? I don't really know. They're just going with the flow, I think.
It's the woke thing to be at the minute, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the interesting thing is this is supposed to be celebrating Black Lives Month. But I've got many black friends who detest it. You don't have a White Lives Month. Why should we have a Black Lives Month? And, when I'm watching the mainstream media, it's the white presenters wanting to make the big thing of the black community. And that in itself just seems so false to me and so artificial.
The way I say it with like Black history, if someone wants to make a documentary or have some sort of focus or write a book about the experience of black people in Britain, I think great, okay, that's interesting. But the problem is it's not just that this is one of the many interesting parts of history we could look at. It's pushing a wider agenda. And we know that. And then what happens is people get fed up of seeing these things again and again and again. Then when people realize this is not just people following up certain historical interest, this is pushing a certain agenda, and that tends to breed resentment. It just plays into the downward cycle of tension and conflict.
Yeah,
which I think is what they'd like. It's what a lot of people would like, because you can have this conflict. The more you can convince people that our current society is completely broken, we really need to throw it overboard and start from scratch. But that's what they want to persuade people is the case.
I think one of the sadnesses to me and the challenge is to see how much the universities in the UK have bought into this no platforming, this woke culture. And when I first went to study, you enjoyed being a student because you explored every idea going. Now they just shut down every opinion that doesn't agree with yours. And I think that to me is because the academic institutions are usually the ivory towers of ideology. And to see that happen like this today, what's that going to produce on the streets 20 years from now?
Oh yeah. I think the omens are not good on that front. I actually got a university textbook about critical race theory. I pulled it off my shelf just before the live stream. Remember when I was at university, you'd study the textbook and you'd have questions, and the questions would be pretty tough. I studied engineering. You'd get your calculator out and try and work it out, and hopefully you get the right answer. But it was pretty demanding stuff. Listen to these questions. You get a degree for answering questions like this. Would it not be logical for blacks, Latinos, Asians, and Native Americans to unite in one powerful coalition to confront the power system that is oppressing them all? If so, what prevents them from doing so? The nation's prisons and jails are full of minority inmates, especially young men. Is that racist? If so, what should be done about it? How about this one? This is a real classic. What role do you see for leftist political theory, such as critical race theory, in the years ahead? What role do you see for yourself? So not even covering it up. It's a training manual for hard left political activism. Out of a university textbook. I think we've got generations of young people who are coming through with these views. I think you've got to be quite independently minded to be able to step outside, the water that everyone's swimming in, if you like, and be able to see things objectively. That's quite a big ask, but
I had the opportunity last week to interview the Israeli ambassador, and I was asking her, on behalf of students and our young people, she is a diplomat. How do you, with diplomacy, debate an opinion that you know is against the cultural trend?
Mm-hmm.
And her response was, you just have to have the courage and make your argument clear.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to, you know, our young folks need to learn that kind of courage and that ability, and realize that what's coming at them is not truth. It's an idea, and most of it unproven. It's a theory, but it's presented as fact, and it's presented as this is the way life is, not the way that the life is perceived by a certain group of people.
Yeah, yeah. But if someone goes to university and they listen to Professor someone or other propounding these ideas, and then you go home and mum or dad says, "No, I don't think that's true." I mean, it's quite a stretch for that young person to say, "Oh yeah, Professor so and so, who I'm paying £1,000 a year to go and listen to, whatever. Yeah, maybe he is talking rubbish. Maybe mum and dad actually do know, or my other friend, maybe they really do know a bit more about this. I've got a better view of it."
Yeah,
it's quite an uphill struggle, isn't it, for that to happen?
it is.
And I think the solution for universities is it's not easy to see. You could try and regulate them more, but I don't know.
You know, for me, this is why I think church is so important. I think as a church, we should be training, preparing our children, our teenagers, and our students for the life that's ahead of them. And that includes identity. You know, we are convinced as Christians they're fearfully and wonderfully made. You are a very special individual. God made you. Be confident in your identity, not try to swap it for somebody else's. And I think we need to train our young people. The church needs to find its place again in being current and relevant to equip and empower our people for the life that's coming.
Yeah, absolutely. My view is I think sometimes churches choose which issues they would like to talk about.
Yeah.
They would like to talk about the love of God helping you in difficult times or whatever. And there's lots of other issues that they really would rather not have to talk about.
Yeah.
But I think to some degree, there isn't really a choice, because if people are being fed alternative views through the rest of the week from every direction, especially young people, then I think if there's not like a systematic effort to try and counter those, then that's a strategy for people going off in different directions.
I think the challenge that the church has is some of its history, in that when we have tried, the church this is, to instruct or teach or preach on these issues, it's been done in a terrible, judgmental manner. The church seems to have a history of picking favorite sins, and then it's gone down the road of hammering that sin, rather than understanding that we're all sinners and we all need the grace of God. We can't change or save ourselves. We need help with that. That's our view as a Christian. And I'm finding that our young people in particular, Gen Zs in particular, have a massive sense of justice. So if they see a Christian leader speaking out against, let's say, homosexuality, and they have friends like that, you're picking on my friend. That sense of justice matters more to them than what's being said. So the way things are said, it needs to be said in a grace-filled way. God loves everybody. You know, we love sin at Destiny. Everybody's welcome. It doesn't matter your sexuality. You're welcome. You can come to this church like anybody else can come to this church, because we all need God to help us. Yeah.
I think what you were saying about justice there is really important. I was talking to someone a while ago who works for a Christian campaigning organization, and they said they found with young people, generally speaking, they're not interested in things unless you can present it as a justice point. I remember a few years ago at the school I was working at, I did some research, and I saw it was talking about moral opinions. So one of my opening questions was, name the worst thing you can think of, the most wrong act you could possibly come up with, thinking you're going to get murder or something. One of the boys said, treating people unequally.
Wow.
I said, is that the best you could do? Yeah, that's the the thing. So there's a lot of things, a lot of areas of morality where justice doesn't really cover them. You can sort of try and stretch the concept of justice to cover them, but basically there's more to morality than justice. So I think that's another challenge of helping people to see to develop a broader moral philosophy, if you like, rather than this justice, which they takes to be very closely related to equality.
Yeah.
Which then becomes very closely attached to equality of outcome, and then you're right into the identity politics.
I've just finished writing a new book called Astronomical Grace. It'll be published before the end of the year. But there's a whole piece in that about morality. What is morality?
Mm-hmm.
Who decides what is moral, and how do we have a moral judgment anyway?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really interesting subject to look at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of moral discussion in Scotland, it skips over where does it come from. Everyone assumes that, oh, that's obvious. We all know that. We all know it's wrong to hurt people. Then they just get on with the practical cases. But actually, I think often when people try to look at the foundations, there actually isn't anything there.
Yeah,
there isn't really any ground rock.
Yeah,
what's been built on. But that's a whole other issue we could go down.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of the Black Lives Matter thing, I mean, do you feel within your church that overall the discussions around it have been strengthening and uniting? Do you feel you've ended up in a positive place after the initial tension?
I think for us we have. I think it's ended up in a positive place primarily because everybody wanted it to end up in a positive place. There was the will there for it to be like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was in a positive place because we went and looked and listened and heard people's experiences of racism, which unfortunately is very real and it's concerning. But also we've spent some time talking to our young people about critical theory, why biblically there's a problem with that. But I do know of churches up and down the UK where it's brought great division and massive problems. Because some people think that if you don't identify completely with the movement, Black Lives Matter, then you must be racist.
Yeah.
And that obviously isn't the case. Yeah.
Well, I had a case like that. As a very prominent UK Christian leader, I won't name. I saw a Facebook post they'd done. They were promoting the Black Lives Matter movement, and I put a comment on saying, are you sure about this? Is considering this. And before too long, he came back and said I was racist.
Wow.
Which I was quite shocked by that. And I gave him plenty of chance to say, are you really sure you feel you've got grounds to be saying that? And he stuck to his guns with it. I would say no matter what the issue is, but I think the problem we have here is when something becomes seen as something that isn't a controversial issue. So if people think it's not controversial, then you can teach it in schools, you can go down that line in church, whatever. But these things are contentious. There are different opinions on them. But the problem we have on so many things, it relates to the hate speech thing as well, is the impression you could gain in Scotland or other things is there is only actually one valid opinion. There's the nice people who believe the same as everybody else. And then there's just a small group of sort of evil fanatics who we need to try and deal with. And a lot of people end up in that thinking. That's the way they see the world. It's
And I have to say, even for myself, when that George Floyd thing happened, which is terrible to see, and everybody was horrified by that visual image of a guy dying in such a terrible way as that, I didn't, at that point, when that happened, realize that Black Lives Matter was driven by cultural Marxism, critical theory. I understood cultural Marxism and critical theory because I'd studied it at university. I knew what that theory was, but I did not realize that was that theory driving that project. And I think there are thousands of people like that. They don't understand what's driving it. If you get an understanding of it, and once I saw those things were really connected together, it's a very dark movement. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, our time is our time is up. It's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. We've covered a lot of ground.
That went quick, Richard.
I told you it would, didn't I? No, maybe in a few months, if you wanted to come back on, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on some other things as well. So yeah, really appreciate all that you're doing. So best wishes with the various cases.
Thank you.
Continue with the fight there. So we're right behind you with that, and really appreciate you coming on tonight. So thanks very much. Shame we can't have a round of applause from the audience, but you don't get that on the internet. But right, thanks, Andrew.
Take care, Richard. God bless.
Right. Good night, everyone, and see you next week for Stuart Waiton. Good night.